The Smiley Man? Who's gonna be scared of a creepypasta named the Smiley Man? What's he gonna do? Smile you to death? Oh, wait. It turns out he can do that. Should I change the title back? Nah. This is probably creepier. Oh! Good evening, Super Horror family and guest. Tonight's creepypasta is about a little girl. Ooh. Guys, children are terrifying. Have you ever seen them eat? Like with their hands? Disgusting. Just make them use spoon!
"It's time to come in, Evie," said my wife to our 6-year-old daughter. She had been outside for far too long, and it was almost dinner time. It was a brisk evening in June, and I had been writing at my desk for the last hour or two, just finishing some things up for the night. I could hear Evie's sweet little voice pipe up saying, "Okay, Mommy." Even through the open window in my office, I could sense the sadness in her voice. "Aren't you hungry, Princess?" asked my wife curiously. I had stopped writing to watch the two interact, because it often put me in a jovial mood. "Yes, Mommy, I am," said Evelyn sweetly. However, something was amiss. My wife stepped into the grass from the patio and held her hand towards our daughter. "Well, come on then, sweetheart. Let's go eat." "What about the Smiley Man?" asked Evie, pointing towards her outdoor playhouse. I inquired from the window, "Who's that, sweetie?" "The Smiley Man. He's hungry too," she said in response with a childish grin. I walked from my office to the backyard patio and stood next to my wife. She didn't seem to have an air of concern surrounding her, but the situation was strange nonetheless. "Well, I'm sure he can find something to eat while we fill your tummy full of Mommy's wonderful cooking," I exclaimed, hoping she would disregard this interesting character of hers. "Yes, Daddy, I'm coming," she said, with the sweetest smile you could ever imagine gracing her beautiful face. But before she could reach me, something grabbed her. Evie began to scream as her arm was being pulled the other way by what appeared to be an invisible entity. "George, what's happening?" "I don't know," I shouted back, before springing into action and quickly reaching our daughter. The moment my hands gripped her shoulder, the unseen tug-of-war going on with her body stopped. She was crying, but she was a strong little girl, so I wiped her tears away and asked, "Evie, what just happened?" "I don't know, Daddy," she said through her tearful blue eyes. "You don't know?" "It's okay, sweetie. You can tell Daddy. Come here." I embraced her so she would feel safe and protected. That's when she whispered in my ear, "The Smiley Man wasn't happy about what you said." "Huh?" I contemplated aloud. But Evelyn didn't say anything else. She just ran to her mother laughing and smiling, as any child would. Her words were concerning, however. Kids make up things all the time, so I chose to disregard it. Although what happened to her seemed quite realistic, maybe a little too real for a child to make up. About a month went by, and Evie continued talking about this Smiley Man. But there hadn't been another incident like the one before. When we would ask her about it, she would just say, "He doesn't like it when I talk about him," and she would do her best to change the subject. My wife and I both agreed it was just a figment of her strong childlike imagination. One morning, I was standing on the back patio with a cup of coffee, enjoying the early morning air. My wife joined me shortly after, and she leaned her head against my shoulder as we waited for Evie to wake up. But curiously she asked, "What's that?" while pointing to the wooden boards below us. I'm not sure how, or why I didn't notice it earlier, but there were 2 bottle caps filled with a deep red substance. Anyone with common sense could tell that it was blood, but it definitely was not put there by myself nor my wife. It was weird, to say the least. We both decided to wake our daughter up to get her ready for the day. It was Saturday, so there wasn't much going on. My wife, however, came to me with a face flushed of all color and a look of fear sunk into her eyes. "You look like you just met the dead," I said jokingly. "You need to come see our daughter right now," she said with a trembling voice. I knew by her tone that she was more than serious. "What's wrong?" I asked while following her to Evie's room. "It's her fingers, George, it's her fingers. They're pricked all over like she's been playing with berry bushes." "What?" I couldn't understand what she meant until I saw Evelyn with my own eyes. The tip of every finger on both of her hands had a puncture mark. It was like she'd been running a game of five-finger fillet and managed to graze herself each time she drove the knife down. I grabbed her hands and held them close to my face. I'm no doctor, but something was seriously wrong here, and she had a look of sadness about her, like she knew we would be worried. "Baby girl, what happened?" I asked while trying not to seem too concerned, so she wouldn't be upset further. "The Smiley Man," she said softly as she hung her head low. "My darling, who is this man? Is he someone we know?" She shook her head in disagreement, and I turned to look at my wife. She was holding her hand near her mouth in shock, and I admit, I didn't know what to do. I faced Evie again and asked, "Did he tell you to do these things?" She shook her head no again. "Well, did he do these things to you?" I asked in response. This time she shook her head yes. My wife moved further into the room and knelt by my side. "Honey, tell us what happened, please. I promise we can help," she said with the most calming voice she could muster. Evelyn started to sob. He poked my fingers." Then she turned her teary eyes towards us. "He said he needed to feed." "Feed?" I ask, and my wife and I look at each other in confusion. "No, Daddy, feed," she said again. I realized this time that her missing teeth were causing her to mispronounce the letter F. I raised my eyebrows and held her hands within mine. "Do you mean feed, sweetie?" She nodded, and I must say I felt a genuine unsettling sensation in the pit of my stomach. My wife gripped my shoulder, and we both stared at our daughter, who at this moment was incredibly vulnerable. My wife and I helped address her wounds, and made a note to talk to a doctor. Clearly there was something wrong, and I wasn't sure who exactly would be able to help. I hated not knowing, and I knew my wife felt the same way. But things escalated violently from that day on. The doctor said that she'd likely gotten into something she shouldn't have, and was placing the blame on this Smiley Man, so that she wouldn't get in trouble. I understood that, but other things began happening. Things that clearly weren't because of her. We had a cat named Sammy that suddenly didn't want to be near Evelyn. She had never hurt the cat. In fact, they were inseparable. Now Sammy would hiss whenever Evie was around, and had even tried to swipe at her. Obviously Evie didn't understand why that was happening, and neither did we. I felt really bad for her, because she loved that cat. Then, things began to go missing. First, it was my wife's wedding ring, and then it was my wallet. They weren't stolen by a thief, because both items in question were in our possessions quite literally minutes before they went missing. We later found them in Evie's room, under her bed, but she claimed the Smiley Man put them there. This was followed by more items going missing. Worst of all was a large kitchen knife. You could guarantee it would all be under Evelyn's bed. What were we to do? I spoke with my wife and we both agreed that talking to Evie about this man was the best course of action, because the strange antics needed to stop. We spoke to her while she was coloring around lunchtime. I was taken back when I saw the malevolent drawing on her page. She had completely drawn over the image that she was meant to color inside of. In its place was a blackened entity with the weirdest, widest, most sinister smile you could ever imagine. Rows and rows of razor-sharp teeth, and the creased corners of its mouth were bleeding. How could my daughter have come up with such a wicked design on her own? I sat next to her and put my hand on her head. What are you drawing, Pumpkin?" I asked calmly. "The smiley man, Daddy," she said as upbeat and cheerful as could be. "This is the smiley man?" I asked, pointing down at her drawing. "Yup," she answered happily. "Evelyn, your dad and I would like it very much if you could stop with this smiley man stuff. We know he's not real, and it isn't good for you to keep bringing him up," said my wife gently from the couch nearby. Evie looked around as if she were incredibly confused. "But Mommy, he's sitting right next to you." My wife looked at both sides of the couch, and then to me. I only shrugged as I didn't understand it either. Evie's face turned into one of great worry, and I asked, "What's the matter, sweetheart?" Her upper lip trembled as she pointed to an empty space next to her mother. "His mouth is around Mommy's head." "What?" I exclaimed while looking back towards my wife. Visibly, I couldn't see a single thing wrong. I even stood up and swatted at the air near where her head was, but felt nothing. "Stop, Daddy! He doesn't like that!" shouted Evelyn from behind me, and suddenly as I turn around, one of her colored pencils lifts into the air and shot straight at me. I ducked my head and the pencil continued going until it stuck into the wall on the other side of the room, burying itself almost entirely within. "George, what the hell was that?" questioned my wife, with eyes like fear-stricken pools of autumn. I don't know." "Evelyn, what's going on?" I tried not to barrage our daughter with questions she couldn't answer, but she seemed to be at the root of what was happening. She started to cry before her whole body levitated all the way up to the ceiling. Now she was screaming and reaching her hands to me, but I couldn't reach her. "Daddy, help!" she cried while being dragged along the length of the ceiling. "George, help her!" shouted my wife from the couch. "What am I supposed to do? She's on the ceiling," I said back to her. I wasn't just going to do nothing, though, despite my complaint. There was a chair near Evie that would give me just enough reach to hopefully grab onto her. As soon as I was under her, though, she dropped and was sent hurtling towards the ground at a distance that a child her age would surely suffer immense pain from. Luckily, I was right there, and able to catch her before that unfortunate possibility. "You believe me now, Daddy?" asked Evelyn, with a sense of maturity I didn't know she had. "Yes, sweetie. I believe you. We both believe you," I said while staring at my wife. She was visibly shaking, and understandably so. However, we didn't know what to do about this smiley man plaguing our daughter. What's even worse is that Evelyn began to get sick. Really sick. One morning she woke up looking incredibly under the weather. Her black hair had a sheen to it like it was wet, but she hadn't taken a bath. Her skin was a greenish-blue hue, and her face was gaunt. The only thing she could say was, "I don't feel so good." We did our best to take care of her. When we took her to the doctor, they didn't seem to notice anything wrong with her, even though it was blatantly obvious. They went as far as to say we were projecting an illness on her that she shouldn't have, but that was ridiculous, because she started coughing up blood. We were not projecting that bullshit onto our daughter. A week ago, she took a turn for the better. She seemed to be entirely back to normal, and my wife and I were both eternally grateful. However, she started wearing this creepy smile. It wouldn't be so ominous if she didn't have the look of malice in her eyes, a look that a child shouldn't have. 4 days ago, my wife screamed from the kitchen, not a scream of horror, but one of pain. When I ran into the room to see what happened, I saw a pool of blood forming beneath her feet. There was shattered glass everywhere. It didn't take me long to figure out that Evelyn had done it. After all, she was still holding the handles to the glasses she broke with that diabolical smile on her face. I tended to my wife's wounds and cleaned up the glass. I remember hearing inhuman laughter from somewhere in the house. A part of me wondered if it was coming from the cabinets in front of me, but I dared not open them because the whole situation had me terrified. That's when I noticed Evelyn had her head peeking out at me from around the corner. The next day, my wife and I were awoken by the sound of our cat, Sammy, yowling. I jumped out of bed and ran into the hall, only to slip on something and fall on my back. When I regained my composure, I saw I had slipped on a trail of blood that went from our room to Evie's room. I stood up and followed the trail carefully, so I didn't slip again. When I entered her room that day, I was horrified. Our cat Sammy was half eaten in the corner, and Evie's mouth was covered in blood.
"What have you done?"
I shouted. "The smiley man was hungry," Evelyn said, smiling to reveal bits of flesh caught amongst her scarcely grown teeth. Oh my God. Evie, this is too far, I said, and I heard my wife gasp from the hallway. George, what do we do?" she asked, completely petrified by the scene before us. I don't know. Evie, just stay in your room today. It was all I could think of. My wife and I buried our cat, and cleaned up the hallway, as well as Evelyn's room. Our sanity has been wearing thin since then. Evie hasn't been allowed to leave her room unless it's to eat or use the bathroom. We check on her, of course, and she always seems content talking and playing with something my wife and I can't see. Last night, though, it reached a tipping point. As night fell, my wife and I were tucking ourselves into bed. Evelyn was already asleep, and so far, everything seemed to be normal. I fell asleep quickly because I was exhausted from the experience, and I think my wife all but passed out as well. I awoke to the sound of my wife screaming, with her hand shaking my shoulder. When I sat up and asked her what was wrong, she said, "Evie was just in here. She was staring right at me, but it wasn't her face. It was like her mouth stretched away from her, or maybe her face just got wider." I could hear and feel my wife's rapid breathing, and knew that it had most likely not been a bad dream. "Where did she go?" I asked, trying to rub her back for comfort. "She scurried off, on all fours like an animal, but it was fast, George, and her arms and legs, they looked long like a spider's. What's happening to our daughter?" "I don't know, but I'm about to find out," I said as I got out of bed and walked to the darkened hallway. I felt a certain heaviness in the air, and smelled a foul stench that lingered so thick you could taste it. When I looked to the end of the hallway, there was Evelyn, peeking out at me like a kid who's hiding would do. She then beckoned me with her pointer finger, and I almost complied. That was before I heard the voice of my daughter from behind me. "Daddy?" she asked with a gentle, soft voice. I spun around, and there she was, holding a teddy bear. When I faced back down the hall, she was there as well, smiling at me wide and menacingly. "What the hell is going on?" I whispered. But then, Evelyn, the one at the end of the hall, stretched her arm across the width of the entire entryway. Then a leg, then another arm, then another leg. I reached back to see if the other Evelyn was there, but she wasn't. Was it an illusion? I still don't know. The nightlight in the hallway illuminated Evelyn's elongated body as she crawled up the wall onto the ceiling, and her neck stretched thin until it was barely held on. An unnaturally wide smile dawned the face of my child, and all I could do was run back into the bedroom. I slammed the door behind me and told my wife we were leaving. We had to leave. "What's happening?" she asked in protest. "She's crawling on the goddamn ceiling," I shouted back as I did. I heard that same devious laughter from the kitchen outside our door, accompanied with the thudded sounds of what I can only assume was Evelyn crawling on the ceiling. I decided we would go through the window because I wasn't going to try and get by her, and lucky for me, I was someone who kept their keys and wallet in the bedroom. It's a good thing they didn't go missing again. My wife and I escaped through the window and ran barefoot to our car. I heard Evelyn scream in a low, bellowing scream from the inside, followed by the word,
"Hungry."
It sounded like she was destroying the entire house. I didn't want to wait around to find out. My wife and I got into the car and took off into the empty darkness. Tears were streaming down both of our faces, and we didn't say a word to each other. We found a hotel and booked a room for a couple of nights. And yeah, here I am writing about what happened to us. My wife is completely silent, almost like she's retreated into herself. And I don't really know what to say or do either. I spent most of my day looking things up on entities specifically related to the Smiley Man, but I can't find anything substantial. All I know is it might be too late for Evelyn, and I don't think she's our daughter anymore. If your child starts talking about a strange man, demanding her blood for sustenance, get them the help they need. Call a priest.
And they all went to a religious or spiritual institution where they received your preferred religious and or spiritual teaching, and it magically solved all of their problems. The end. Wow, what a great story. If you want to hear another great story about a messed up childhood, you need to watch my video on the Dream Man. Click here. See you there.